Welcome to our 10th video. We're going to be looking at the properties editor, but before we do that, we're actually going to look just very briefly at setting up our scene to use cycles. And that is going to affect some of the things in the properties editor. So when we're setting up our scene, we're going to be using Cycles Render Engine instead of Blender Render. Blender Render is kind of simplifies the way that light works, and it just gives kind of its best estimate. It responds very differently. I can actually go down to this little symbol here to change the viewport shading mode, and I can do rendered to get an idea of what it looks like. Or I can use the shortcut Shift Z. In Blender Render, I have very harsh shadows to start off with. If I switch to Cycles Render, I get a very different effect. It also moves smoother in the viewport. And here I can see that it's doing what we call samples, whereas in Blender Render, if I rotate it, it'll just render that in one section at a time all together. And it doesn't do it overall very fast, but it's actually a little bit easier to see in cycles. And I'm going to go ahead and in cycles, because that's where we want to be, so we're going to get used to switching to cycles. I can hit Z on the keyboard to switch to wireframe, Z back to shaded, and then Shift Z will toggle between shaded and rendered. And so it's just a handy way to switch there really quick. Just so you know, F12 is a fast way to get to the actually rendering a still frame. I'm going to hit Escape to cancel that. Escape again to exit the rendering view there. Over in the properties editor, I'm going to scroll all the way up, and I already made my text a little bit larger by doing Control and adjusting it. But if you were working on this and you were doing things on it with a smaller menu, you can, and so let's say this top line is kind of truncated on the end, you can move that menu back and forth by pushing the middle mouse button down and just dragging it back and forth. I'm going to expand it out and enlarge this again. Control and middle mouse button to do that. In this first tab, we have render settings. And so again, I want to make sure I'm on cycles because we want to just adjust those settings. In the render area, I have a few options. One, I can render a still frame here, or I can render an animation. I can also do some audio setting things. I haven't worked with this before, so I won't cover it right now, but I might touch on that a little bit later. In the feature set, this is if we have a graphics card compatible with Blender, we can actually have it take on the rendering load, and you can get a faster result from, especially with a newer graphics card. Some of the newest ones aren't yet supported, so just be aware of that and kind of keep track of what is or isn't working with it. I can also adjust my dimensions. I'm going to minimize the render panel there. And by default, usually what you'll have is this will start out at 50% in full HD, so it's actually just doing a quarter of the rendering. So if I hit F12 to render the image, I get this smaller size render, and that's actually rendering it full size for it, which is at 50% of full HD. If I move this up and then hit F12, now I get it rendering full size. For our videos that we do and things like that, animations, we will do our video at full HD at 100%. But when you're just testing to make sure something looks okay or is working, then by all means, 50% is a good way of doing that. Saves lots of time, lets you get an idea of what's happening. If you're doing an animation, or if you have an animation but you're doing a still from it and you want a particular frame from that, these are settings that if you click on the Render Animate button up in this section, these will determine what frame it's going to render from. So this will start on frame 1, and this will end on frame 250. And we can also set frame steps. So this is like if you say do 2, then it'll do frame 1, and then it'll do frame 3. I think it might do frame 2 and then 4, and then however that works. But it's going to skip in those intervals. Down a little bit lower, I'm going to go to where it says output. And I'll just go ahead and minimize that section. And in output, here's where we can select where we want it to render files. So I'm going to click on this little file folder. I was playing around with this a little bit earlier. Often it'll start in a temporary folder with a brand new instance of Blender open. So we're going to be saving things into our documents. And then you're going to want to create a folder. For me, I actually have mine in electives and then in Blender because I have lots of folders. And I'm going to create a new folder. And right now I can see this folder created here. I'm going to type in a name for it. So I'm going to do 2018 to 2019, not 1919, 2019. And I'm going to say Blender projects. And then I'm going to find that folder in here. There it is. Open it up. I should see the path up here at the top. And right down here, this is what currently it's going to name the project that I have. So let's say I'm going to call this one box renders. And I'm going to say accept. If I were to render this as an animation, what it'll do is it'll put this as part of the file name, the box renders, and it'll actually add on however I express for it to add on numbers for its naming scheme. So it might do like 001 and then 002 and then 003, and then later on I can put those together, because you can render directly to a video file if you're doing an animation, but I recommend never ever doing that, because if one thing goes wrong, and say you're rendering 1,000 frames of animation, you have to render everything over again. Whereas if you render as PNG, it's my preferred file type, if you render as PNG, you can stitch those together later and render them as any of the video formats that Blender supports. And it's going to be much more likely that that's going to be successful than hitting a rendering error and a compiling or a composition error, or putting everything together. As I go a little bit further down, I'm not going to get into all this, but yes, you can do different color depths. You can do some different types of color management settings and things. Again, we'll get into all that later. Freestyle is an animation type thing for Cycles Render, where you can do like cell type animations, and I haven't messed around with it. It depends on, you have to use shaders that support that as well, but that way you can make your scene look more like a drawing or an anime scene or something like that. Sampling is a section that you should be very familiar with. Sampling is going to affect how things are rendered. So the default preview, I think, is 32. And right now I have this set to render as 300, which I'm not sure why. Oh, this is the number of tiles. It should also tell me somewhere the passes it's, well, actually not. So each time it's doing one of these, what it's doing is it's running each of those squares up to 300 passes because I did a formal render. Whereas if I hit escape and I do Shift Z to go into render mode, right now it goes up to 32. Here I can see the number of passes. It's doing the whole screen at one time. And so it takes a little bit more effort in some ways, but you can adjust these. So if you want your preview, if you want to see it a little bit clearer, I can just set it at 100. For this, 32 is more than I need to see the cube clearly. At 10, it looked fine. In fact, at just a few of those, it looked just fine. I could actually set this down to 5 and rotate it, and that doesn't look bad at all, and it's not doing anywhere near as many calculations. As I get into more types of shaders and different things like that, that's going to make more of a difference having a higher number. 100 is not a bad number to start with. 300 for render view is not bad. Once again, you get into more complex ways of light interacting, like if you have reflective surfaces, transparent surfaces, things like that, then 300 might not be enough, but the more passes you add, that's going to add much more rendering time to your projects. I'm going to go down to, I'm going to skip most of these things, and just go down to where it says performance. And here, if you're rendering, let's say that you're in the middle of class and you want to render and you only have 4 available threads, you might want to say, okay, render with 3 threads, and that way it's going to keep one of your cores active that you can use for other things. It won't slow down the rest of your workflow as you're working on, let's say you need to type something up, or you're doing something else in another Blender editor. Gives you a little bit more flexibility. When I'm rendering a big project, what I'll usually do is I'll select 7 threads on mine, because I have 8 threads available. And then what I'll do is when I'm leaving, I'll bump it up to 8. And when it hits the next frame, it'll use all 8. And then when I come in the morning, if it's still rendering, I'll switch it back down to 7. And that way when it renders that frame, then it'll pick up only 7 threads on the next frame and keep rendering, and I can still use it. Sometimes I might give myself 2 cores if I know whatever work I'm going to do is going to be really tasking on the CPU. Most Office-related stuff that you do doesn't need lots of threads, and a single core is more than enough to run much of the things that you would on your computer. For doing some of the graphics and things like that, having multiple cores available can be a good help. Let's see, I think that's all I wanted to say about that particular section. I'm going to highlight just a couple other things here really quick. For this section, we're not going to do a lot with it, but this is where you can modify your different things that you are rendering or not rendering, do some different settings like that. You can also do, again, just general scene settings. You can go through and change the type of units. This doesn't really matter for anything, so we're not going to worry about it too much. But like you could change from degrees to radians, which would definitely make a difference. Degrees are just nicer to work with a little bit because you're not dealing with decimal values for as you go around the circle. You can deal with decimal values, but it's more likely that so you can have 30 degrees rather than putting that in terms of radians. Also, as we go down, there's some other settings here. Gravity, for instance, if we're doing a simulation and we have things interacting with each other, or I have particles that are being animated and they have are responding in some way to gravity or other forces I put into the scene. This will modify things. If you want the y direction to be where gravity is going, then you would use this value. This value, of course, is something that we look at where this is actually the force of gravity in meters per second. Technically meters per second. This is the acceleration downward. So this is already set up to kind of simulate a real-world environment. You can also do things with the rigid body worlds and stuff, and some other settings that you can play with there too as well. Most of the things on here you don't want to mess with unless you really kind of have an intent for why you want it to act the way you want it to.